Hello everyone, welcome to Horror Stories, and I'm here to share some chilling and mysterious tales with you. I know many of you often use this video to help you sleep and relax, but before we start, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to motivate me to create more content. Also, please introduce yourself, where you're from, and what time you're watching. Now, make yourself comfortable and relax. There's something about the night that used to feel comforting to me. The quiet stillness, the way the stars stretch across the sky like scattered jewels, it always made me feel connected, part of something bigger. I've spent years exploring the wilderness, meditating in forests, studying old rituals and ancient symbols. You could say I have a fascination with the spiritual world. Nature and the energy it holds have always pulled me in, like I'm on some unspoken quest for answers. But that night, everything changed. The wilderness, once my refuge, became something else entirely. It was late, probably around 10 p.m., and I was coming back from a hike just outside town. I live in a small rural area where the woods feel endless. You can drive for miles without seeing another car, and at night, the roads are nothing but long stretches of darkness lit only by the occasional passing streetlight. As I was driving home, the usual calm I felt in the woods wasn't there. Instead, there was this gnawing anxiety in my chest, a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. The trees along the roadside seemed darker, the shadows deeper. My headlights felt like they weren't cutting through the night as well as they usually did. I told myself it was just fatigue, that I was overreacting. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse the closer I got to home. When I pulled into the driveway, the feeling hit me full force, a sense that something was watching me. I don't know why, but I hesitated before getting out of the car, just sitting there with my hands gripping the steering wheel. The wind had picked up, making the trees around my house sway and groan. The sound was unsettling, almost like whispering voices just beyond the edge of my hearing. I took a deep breath, telling myself I was being ridiculous, and finally stepped out of the car. As soon as I did, the air felt heavier, colder than it should have been for a late summer night. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I had the overwhelming urge to look over my shoulder. When I did, there was nothing, just the empty yard, the tree line swaying in the wind, and the quiet hum of the night. Still, I hurried inside, locking the door behind me as if that would somehow keep the creeping anxiety out. My house was dark, except for the faint glow of the moon spilling through the windows. I flipped on a few lights, trying to fill the space with some warmth, but it felt hollow. No matter how many lights I turned on, the shadows in the corners seemed darker than usual. I tried to push it out of my mind and get some sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, set my nerves on edge. At some point, I must have drifted off, but my dreams were strange. Flashes of twisted shapes, symbols I couldn't understand, and an overwhelming sense of dread that followed me even into sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling drained, like I hadn't rested at all. The sunlight streaming through the windows should have brought some sense of peace, but it didn't. That anxiety was still there, sitting heavy in my chest. I decided to go for a walk, thinking maybe some fresh air would clear my head. There's a small wooded area just behind my house where I've spent countless hours over the years, meditating, collecting herbs, or just sitting by the stream that runs through it. It's my space, a place that always made me feel grounded. But today, even the woods felt different. The wind had died down, leaving the forest eerily still. The air was thick, almost oppressive, and every step I took felt like I was being watched. I tried to shake the feeling off, telling myself it was just leftover nerves from the night before, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As I made my way through the trees, something caught my eye near the base of a large oak. It was small, half buried in the dirt and leaves, but there was something about it that made me stop in my tracks. I knelt down and brushed away the debris, revealing what looked like a bone. At first, I thought it might just be an animal bone, but when I picked it up, I realized it was something else entirely. The bone was smooth, almost polished, and about the length of my forearm. But what really struck me were the carvings. All along the length of the bone were strange, intricate symbols, runes, or markings that I didn't recognize. They spiraled around the bone in a way that looked intentional, precise. I've seen plenty of ritual objects in my studies, old artifacts, talismans, things meant to channel energy or ward off spirits, but I'd never seen anything like this. The carvings didn't match any symbol system I was familiar with. They were strange, almost hypnotic in their design. Holding it in my hands, that uneasy feeling I'd had all night intensified. It felt wrong, like the bone shouldn't be here, like it had been placed there on purpose. My fingers traced the carvings, trying to make sense of them. But as I did, a sharp, icy sensation shot up my arm, like I'd touched something that wasn't meant for me. I dropped the bone, my heart racing. The moment it hit the ground, the forest around me seemed to change. The air grew colder, and the once still trees started to sway, even though there was no wind. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, watching, waiting. I backed away slowly, trying to keep my breathing steady, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run. I turned and walked quickly back toward the house, not daring to look over my shoulder, though I could feel eyes on me the entire way. When I finally reached the safety of my home, I locked the door and sat down, trying to collect my thoughts. My mind was racing, replaying the strange events of the night before, and now the bone with those bizarre carvings. What was it? Why had I found it in my woods? And why did it make me feel so afraid? For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about the bone. It was like it had latched onto my thoughts, pulling me back to it over and over again. I tried to distract myself, cleaning the house, reading, anything to keep my mind busy, but the unease lingered. I kept glancing out the window toward the woods, half expecting to see something moving between the trees. But the forest was quiet. That night, the dreams came again, only this time they were clearer. Dark figures moving through the trees, watching me from the shadows. The bone was there too, glowing faintly in the moonlight, the symbols on it shifting and changing as if they were alive. In the dream, I reached out to touch it, and the moment my fingers brushed against it, the figures moved toward me, their eyes glowing with a cold, unnatural light. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The feeling of dread was overwhelming now, suffocating. I couldn't stay in the house any longer. I needed answers. The next morning, I went back into the woods, despite every instinct telling me to stay away. I needed to see the bone again, to try and make sense of what was happening. As I approached the spot where I'd found it, my stomach twisted. The bone was gone. I searched the area, digging through the leaves and dirt, but there was no sign of it. It was as if it had never been there at all. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew it was real. The carvings, the way it felt in my hands, it couldn't have just vanished. That's when I heard it. A low whisper coming from the trees. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. I turned, scanning the forest, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, clearer this time, a soft voice speaking in a language I didn't recognize. My heart raced as I backed away, my eyes darting from tree to tree, searching for the source of the sound. But the forest was empty, or at least it looked that way. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was right next to me. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. I stood there, frozen in place, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't know what to do, what to think. All I knew was that something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The rest of that day was a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even inside my own home. The house, once my sanctuary, now felt like a trap, every creak and shadow twisting my nerves tighter. I paced from room to room, my mind racing with questions I didn't know how to answer. Where had the bone gone? What was the whispering I'd heard? And why did it feel like something was closing in on me? As night began to fall, that oppressive weight in the air returned, heavier than before. I kept telling myself I should leave, get in the car and drive far away. But something held me back, a strange compulsion that I couldn't explain. It was like I had to stay, had to see this through, even though every instinct in me screamed that I was in danger. I tried to distract myself by turning on the TV, but the noise only made the silence around me feel thicker. The flickering screen cast strange, uneven shadows across the room, making me jump at every small movement. Eventually, I turned it off, leaving the house in darkness except for the pale light of the moon filtering through the windows. That's when I heard it again, a faint whisper, just outside. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was the same sound I'd heard in the woods earlier that day, a low, almost unintelligible murmur, like someone speaking just out of earshot. I held my breath, straining to listen. The whispering grew louder, coming from the direction of the back door that led to the woods. Slowly, I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me. The house felt deathly quiet, the air thick with tension. I moved toward the window, cautiously peeking through the blinds. The backyard was bathed in moonlight, empty, with the tree line standing ominously in the distance. But the whisper was still there. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it surrounded me, like the sound was in the walls, seeping through the very structure of the house. My pulse quickened, and every hair on my body stood on end as I backed away from the window. I didn't know what to do. Running felt pointless. Whatever this was, it wasn't something I could escape by driving away. Suddenly, there was a soft knock at the door. My heart nearly stopped. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, the same pattern I'd heard before. The air in the room seemed to freeze, and I found myself rooted to the spot, my mind racing. My first instinct was to ignore it, to pretend I wasn't home. But the knock came again, louder this time. Against my better judgment, I moved toward the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. I don't know what I expected to find. Maybe nothing. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But when I opened the door, my blood turned to ice. There, lying on the doorstep, was the bone. The same bone I had found in the woods, with the same strange carvings spiraling along its surface. But now, the symbols were glowing faintly, pulsing with an eerie, otherworldly light. I stared at it, my mind screaming at me to close the door to get away, but I couldn't move. It was like the bone had me in its grip, pulling me in. And then slowly, I heard the whisper again, this time clear and unmistakable, coming from the bone itself. "You are marked." I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the bone's glow grew brighter, the symbols shifting and twisting as if they were alive. I slammed the door shut, locking it and backing away, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The whispering didn't stop. It filled the room, growing louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices all speaking at once. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. I didn't know who to call. The police? What would I even say? "Hi, I found a cursed bone in the woods and now my house is haunted." They'd think I was crazy. But something was happening, something real. And I needed help. As I sat there, phone clutched in my hand, the whispering suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, that feeling of being watched more intense than ever before. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. It was subtle at first, a flicker of shadow near the doorway, like something shifting just out of sight. I turned slowly, my heart in my throat, and there it was. A figure. It stood just inside the doorway to the living room, half hidden in the darkness. At first I thought it was a person, a tall, shadowy silhouette, but as my eyes adjusted I realized it wasn't human. Its body was too long, its limbs too thin and elongated, like something stretched beyond the limits of its form. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. My body refused to move, paralyzed by the sheer terror that gripped me. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. The only sound in the room was my ragged breathing, and even that seemed too loud, too intrusive. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, and with each step, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. I could see my breath now, coming out in shaky clouds, and the sense of dread was overwhelming. Then, without warning, the figure spoke. Its voice was a rasping whisper, like the sound of dry leaves scraping against each other. "You took what was not yours," it said, its voice echoing in my head. "Now it belongs to you." My mind raced. The bone. It had to be talking about the bone. I didn't understand what was happening, didn't know why this was happening to me, but I had to get rid of it. I had to get the bone as far away from me as possible. I bolted toward the door, my legs finally obeying me. I flung it open and snatched the bone from the doorstep. its glow brighter now, almost blinding. The carvings seemed to twist and writhe beneath my fingers, the symbols burning into my skin like fire. But I didn't care. I had to get rid of it. I ran into the woods, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The trees loomed overhead, casting long shadows across the ground, and the wind howled through the branches like a living thing. I didn't stop until I reached the stream where I had found the bone the first time. Without thinking, I hurled the bone into the water, watching as it sank beneath the surface, the glow fading as it disappeared. For a moment, everything was still. The wind died down, the trees stopped swaying, and the whispering in my head went silent. I stood there, panting, waiting for something, anything to happen. But there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of the forest and the soft trickle of the stream. I let out a shaky breath, my body trembling from the adrenaline. It was over. I had gotten rid of the bone. Whatever curse or spirit had been tied to it was gone now, buried beneath the water. Or so I thought. As I turned to leave, I heard it again. A soft whisper carried on the wind. "You are marked." And this time I knew the truth. It wasn't the bone that was cursed. It was me. You know how people talk about strange things happening in the woods? How the forest seems alive at night, like it's watching you? I always thought that was just folklore, ghost stories to scare kids around a campfire. But something happened to me and my friends when we were teenagers that I still can't explain. And even now, the memory of it sends a chill down my spine. It all started with what we thought was a dog. I remember the day vividly. It was late summer and the air was thick with humidity. I was 16, hanging out with my two best friends, Matt and Eric. We'd grown up in this small town surrounded by woods, and on weekends we'd usually head out there to mess around, build fires, climb trees, tell each other ridiculous stories about monsters in the forest. It was our place, a refuge from the boredom of small town life. This time, though, something felt different. We were deep in the woods, maybe a mile or two from town, walking along a narrow trail we'd followed a dozen times before. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows through the trees. There was this weird stillness in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. No birds, no insects, just silence. "I don't like this," Matt muttered, breaking the quiet. He was always the first to get spooked, even though he tried to play it cool. "You say that every time," Eric laughed, but his voice was a little too loud, like he was trying to convince himself more than us. "What, you think Bigfoot's gonna jump out and grab us?" I snorted, kicking a rock down the trail. "Relax. We'll be back before dark. Just trying to find that spot by the stream again." Matt didn't respond. He just kept glancing over his shoulder like he was expecting something to come out of the woods. I figured he was just being paranoid, until we heard the sound. It was faint at first, almost like a soft whine. We all stopped, listening. It came again, louder this time, a high-pitched, eerie sound that made my skin crawl. It was coming from somewhere up ahead, deeper in the trees. "What the hell is that?" Eric asked, his voice lower now, more serious. He wasn't laughing anymore. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe an animal?" "It sounds like a dog," Matt said, squinting into the woods. "But I don't know, something's off." The sound came again, this time mixed with what I can only describe as a clicking noise, like bones snapping or the crack of dry branches underfoot. It was getting closer. I felt a pit form in my stomach, a deep sense of unease. Every instinct I had was telling me to turn back, but before I could say anything, we saw it. A shape emerged from the trees. It looked like a dog at first, but there was something wrong with it. It had short, white fur, almost glowing in the fading light, but its movements were unnatural, jerky, stiff, like it didn't quite know how to move its body. Its head was too large for its frame, and the way it turned toward us, its eyes reflecting the dying sunlight, made my blood run cold. It wasn't just looking at us, it was studying us. None of us spoke. We just stood there, staring at this thing. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves above, and the dog thing opened its mouth. But instead of barking, it let out this chilling, guttural sound, a mix of a growl and a human scream. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. "We need to get out of here," Matt whispered, his voice shaking. Eric, usually the brave one, nodded slowly. "Yeah, man, let's go." We turned to leave, but as soon as we started walking, we heard the clicking sound again. This time, it was behind us. I whipped around, and there it was. The creature had moved faster than we could have imagined. It was standing in the middle of the path we had just come from, blocking our way out. How had it gotten there so quickly? And then, it did something I'll never forget. It stood up. Its limbs lengthened, its back cracking as it stretched unnaturally tall. The fur receded, leaving behind pale human-like skin, and its face, God, its face. It still had the vague shape of a dog, but now it was twisted, distorted into something more humanoid. Its eyes glowed, and the scream it let out was deafening, like a chorus of voices crying out at once. We ran. I don't remember the specifics, just the sheer terror, the sound of branches snapping under our feet as we sprinted through the woods, trying to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever that thing was. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were going to give out, but I didn't stop. None of us did. We didn't dare. Somehow, we made it back to the edge of the woods, gasping for breath as we stumbled onto the main road. I glanced back once, just once, but the creature was gone. The forest was silent again, like nothing had happened. We didn't speak for a long time. The three of us just stood there, trying to process what we had seen. Finally, Eric broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I said, still shaking. It wasn't a dog. It couldn't have been." Matt, pale as a ghost, nodded. "It wasn't just that. Did you guys see how fast it moved? Like it knew we were coming." None of us wanted to admit it, but we all knew something was wrong. Something far beyond a strange animal sighting. We decided to head home, promising each other that we wouldn't talk about it to anyone. Who would believe us anyway? But that wasn't the end of it. Not even close. A few weeks later, Matt called me in a panic. I could barely make out what he was saying at first, but the fear in his voice was unmistakable. "You need to come over," he said, his words coming out in a frantic rush. Now. When I got to his house, Matt was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He didn't waste time with small talk. He just pulled me into his room and shut the door. "You're not going to believe this," he whispered, pacing back and forth. "I was out by the woods today, just walking, trying to clear my head, and I saw you." I blinked, confused. "What are you talking about? I haven't been near the woods since that day." "I know," he said, his voice trembling. "That's what I thought. But I swear, I saw you. You were walking through the trees, heading deeper into the forest. I called out to you, but you didn't respond. You just kept walking." A cold chill ran down my spine. "Matt, I wasn't there. I've been at home all day." "I know that," he snapped, running a hand through his hair. "But it was you. Same clothes, same everything. It wasn't a look-alike. It was you." I didn't know what to say. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. My mind raced back to that night in the woods, to the creature we'd seen. Could it have followed us? Could it have copied me? "I don't understand," I muttered. "What did it do?" Matt shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "Nothing. It just kept walking, disappearing into the trees. But it was you. I swear it was you." The next few days were a blur of sleepless nights and growing paranoia. Everywhere I went, I felt like I was being watched. The woods, once a place of freedom and adventure, now felt like a looming presence, always waiting just at the edge of my vision. And then, one evening, I saw it for myself. I was walking home from the store, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. As I passed the entrance to the woods, something caught my eye. A figure, standing just inside the tree line. It was me. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure was identical to me. Same clothes, same posture, even the same expression on its face. It was like looking into a mirror, but wrong, twisted. Before I could move, it smiled. Not a friendly smile, but something cold, calculating. And then it turned and disappeared into the woods. I haven't gone back into those woods since. None of us have. But I know it's still out there, watching, waiting. And I can't shake the feeling that one day it's going to come back for me. It was a chilly Friday night when Josh and I decided to do something stupid. Stupid because it seemed like a great idea at the time, but we should have known better. One of those moments where you think this could go really wrong, but you shrug it off because you don't believe it will. Yeah, That's exactly what we were doing. We had no idea how terrifying that night would turn out to be. It all started with Josh suggesting we check out the woods near my house. Now, these weren't just any woods. There were stories, crazy ones, about strange things happening in there. People hearing weird noises, feeling like they were being watched. Of course, everyone thought it was just made-up nonsense to keep kids from wandering in at night. But that didn't stop the curiosity. It was about 11 p.m. when we left my house, armed with nothing but our phones, a weak flashlight that Josh had dug up from his garage, and some stupid sense of adventure. The air had that crisp bite to it, the kind you feel deep in your bones as the cold starts creeping under your skin. I remember the wind rustling the leaves in a way that seemed almost too quiet. You could hear every crack of a twig under our shoes, and the farther we walked, the darker it got. The moon wasn't much help either. It was hidden behind thick clouds, casting just enough light to make out the outline of the trees, but not much more. At first, it felt like any other walk through the woods. We joked around, laughing nervously at how creepy everything seemed. Trying to downplay the fear by making light of it. But then, maybe after 10 minutes of walking deeper into the woods, something changed. The air felt heavier, colder. It was like we'd walked into a place where sound was swallowed up. You could hear the wind, but it felt distant, like it was coming from somewhere far away. That's when we heard it, the barking. It wasn't too loud at first, just a faint, distant bark like a dog in the distance. Josh and I stopped dead in our tracks, staring at each other, both thinking the same thing. What was a dog doing out here? The nearest houses were a good mile away. It could have been a stray, maybe someone's pet that had wandered off. But this bark, it sounded too controlled, too rhythmic. There was something off about it, but we couldn't put our finger on why. It wasn't until the barking grew louder, echoing off the trees, that the first real pang of fear hit. Maybe we should head back, I muttered, my voice shakier than I wanted it to sound. Josh just shook his head, trying to laugh it off. It's just a dog, man. Chill. Probably a lost one or something. But even he didn't sound too sure anymore. We kept walking, trying to act normal, but there was no denying that something felt wrong. The bark came again, sharper this time, closer. Too close. My stomach knotted up, and I swear the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, we realized something horrifying. The bark wasn't natural. It was being played through speakers. At first, it didn't make sense. Why would there be speakers out here? But the more we listened, the clearer it became. The sound was too clean, too perfect. There was no echo, no variation like you'd hear if it were coming from a real animal. It was the same tone, the same volume, over and over again, almost like someone was playing it on loop. I remember Josh's face going pale as the realization hit both of us at the same time. This wasn't a dog. Someone was out here, playing that sound, trying to mess with us. Or worse. We need to go, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Josh nodded, and we turned around, ready to bolt. But before we could take more than a few steps, the barking grew louder, more frantic, and it was coming from all around us. Every direction. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my legs turning to jelly as I tried to make sense of it. It was like we were surrounded, trapped in this invisible cage of sound, and whoever, or whatever, was playing it, it wanted us to know we weren't alone. "Run!" Josh shouted, and we both took off, sprinting through the trees, dodging branches and stumbling over roots. I don't remember how long we ran, but every second felt like an eternity. The barking followed us, no matter how fast or far we went. It was relentless, pressing in on us from every angle, making it impossible to think straight. I could feel something behind us, even though I couldn't see it. It wasn't just the sound anymore. There was this presence, like someone was right on our heels, chasing us, waiting for us to trip, to fall, to give up. The trees felt like they were closing in, the darkness suffocating, and my lungs were burning, but we didn't stop. We couldn't. And then, just when I thought I couldn't run any longer, Josh stumbled. His foot caught on a root, and he went down hard, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. I skidded to a stop, turning back to help him up, but as I reached out to grab his arm, the barking suddenly stopped. Dead silence. It was so quiet that I could hear my own ragged breathing, the blood pounding in my ears. I froze. my hand still gripping Josh's arm, both of us too scared to move. The silence was worse than the barking. It was unnatural, wrong. "Do you hear that?" Josh whispered, his voice trembling. I shook my head, not understanding what he meant. But then I heard it, a soft rustling like something was moving through the trees. Slowly, deliberately. My heart sank as I realized what it was. Footsteps. Someone was out there, walking toward us, and they weren't in any hurry. Josh scrambled to his feet, and we stood there, backs pressed against a tree, trying to control our breathing, trying to stay as still as possible. But the footsteps kept coming, getting closer and closer, until they were right behind us. I could feel the hairs on my neck prickling, the cold sweat trickling down my back. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. And then, just as suddenly as they'd started, the footsteps stopped. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but silence. No barking, no footsteps, nothing. I was too terrified to even turn around, convinced that if I did, I'd see something I couldn't handle. Josh and I exchanged a terrified glance, both of us trying to figure out what the hell was happening. That's when we heard it. A voice. Low, almost a whisper, coming from right behind us. "You shouldn't have come here." I didn't wait to see who or what said it. I grabbed Josh's arm, and we ran. Faster than we'd ever run in our lives. Branches whipped across my face, tearing at my skin, but I didn't care. We just had to get out of there. Somehow, we made it back to the edge of the woods, gasping for air as we stumbled onto the road. I don't remember the exact moment we crossed that invisible line between the forest and safety, but as soon as we did, the feeling of being chased vanished. We stopped running, our bodies collapsing in exhaustion. The barking, the footsteps, the voice, they were all gone, like they'd never existed in the first place. But the fear, that stayed with me, etched into my memory like a scar. To this day, I have no idea what really happened in those woods. Was it a prank? Some sick game someone was playing? Or was it something else? Something we weren't meant to understand? Josh and I don't talk about it much anymore, but every now and then, when I'm lying awake at night, I can still hear that barking. I'm not sure where to begin. Every time I think about that night, I feel this knot in my stomach, like I can't quite breathe. It was supposed to be a simple party. Just a night out with some friends, a few drinks, maybe meet a few new people. Nothing special. But it turned into something none of us could have predicted. Something I don't think any of us will ever forget. It started with an invitation. Not an invitation in the traditional sense. No fancy envelope or RSVP required, but more like a text from someone we barely knew. You know how it is when you're in college. There are always people throwing random parties, inviting friends of friends, not caring who shows up as long as the place is packed. That's what we thought it was. I'd only met Alice once, and she seemed cool enough. A friend of a friend, someone who was always at the same parties, but never someone I really knew. So when she messaged Sarah, my roommate, about this party happening somewhere outside the city, we didn't think too much about it. We were bored, and the idea of something different was appealing. The more mysterious, the better, right? Or so we thought. There were 5 of us. Me, Sarah, her boyfriend Jake, and 2 of our other friends, Nick and Emma. We piled into Jake's car around 9 p.m., laughing and joking about how weird it was that we had no idea whose party we were going to. But at that point, it was all fun, just another random adventure. The drive took about an hour. We followed Alice's vague directions down winding roads that seemed to stretch on forever. As the city lights faded behind us, the darkness outside felt thicker, the roads quieter. I remember looking out the window and seeing nothing but tall trees and patches of fog swirling across the pavement, illuminated by the car's headlights. The air was cold, even inside the car, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were heading somewhere we didn't belong. But I didn't say anything. I didn't want to be that person, the one who kills the mood by being paranoid. We finally pulled up to this huge house. It was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense woods, with only a single dirt road leading up to it. The house itself was massive, almost like an old mansion, but not quite. There was something off about it. The lights were all on, too bright, almost glaring, and there was music, loud but not the kind you'd expect at a party. It was classical, but distorted somehow, like it wasn't coming from speakers, but from the house itself. "Are we sure this is the right place?" Jake asked, looking around. Sarah checked her phone and nodded. "Yeah, Alice said this is it." So we got out. The air outside was freezing, colder than I'd expected for an October night. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, my breath visible in the air. We headed up to the front door, which was already open, letting the bright light and music spill out into the dark. As soon as we stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The atmosphere was wrong. It's hard to explain, but you know how most parties have this buzz, this energy that makes you feel like you're part of something? This was the opposite. The house was packed with people, but it was quiet. The music played in the background, but no one was really dancing or talking. Everyone was standing around, dressed way too formally for what we'd expected. A lot of them in suits and long dresses, like they were attending a gala, not some casual house party. I exchanged a glance with Sarah. She looked just as confused as I felt. We were in jeans and jackets, clearly out of place. But it wasn't just the clothes. It was the way everyone was looking at us, like we didn't belong. "Maybe we should have dressed up," Nick joked, but his voice was uneasy. We tried to mingle, but the people at the party weren't like anyone I'd ever met. They didn't introduce themselves, didn't ask who we were or how we knew about the party. Instead, they stared, long, uncomfortable stares, as if they were studying us. I caught one woman in particular, her gaze piercing, her lips parted in a slight smile, but her eyes cold. Every time I turned around, she was watching us. "I don't like this," Emma whispered to me. "Something's off." I nodded, feeling the same tension growing in my chest. But I didn't want to overreact. We'd only been there for 20 minutes, and I figured maybe we were just out of our element. Maybe this was some weird, high-end crowd we weren't used to. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the stares weren't just curious, they were expectant, like they were waiting for something. That's when I noticed the marks. It started with a guy standing near the fireplace. He was older, probably in his mid-40s, wearing a sharp black suit. At first, I thought the lighting was playing tricks on me, but as I looked closer, I saw it, a faint greenish mark on his neck, just below his ear. It was like a bruise, but not quite, almost as if it were glowing faintly under his skin. I nudged Sarah and pointed it out, but she just shrugged. "It's probably nothing," she said, but I could tell she was uneasy too. The more I looked, the more I saw it, not on everyone, but on enough people that it stood out. Little green marks on their necks, all in the same place. "I'm getting a weird vibe," Jake muttered, pulling Sarah closer. "Maybe we should head out soon." Before we could decide anything, though, Emma grabbed my arm. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Look at Nick." I turned, my heart pounding in my chest. Nick was standing by one of the large windows, chatting with a couple we didn't know. And there it was, on his neck. But unlike the others, his mark wasn't green. It was red, bright red, like a burn or a fresh wound. "Nick," I called, my voice shaky. "What's on your neck?" He looked at me, confused, and reached up to touch the spot. What are you talking about?" But before I could explain, the music stopped. Dead silence filled the room, and every single person turned to look at us. The stares were different now, no longer just curious or unsettling, but predatory. I could feel my pulse racing, my hands shaking. Something was very, very wrong. A man stepped forward. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, his face sharp and expressionless. He looked at each of us slowly, deliberately, before his gaze settled on me. "Who invited you?" he asked, his voice low, calm, but with an edge that made my skin crawl. "Alice," Sarah stammered. "Alice invited us." The man's eyes flicked over to one of the guests, a woman with dark hair and that same green mark on her neck. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "I think it's time for you to leave," the man said, his voice tightening. We didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed Sarah's hand, and the five of us headed for the door as fast as we could without breaking into a full sprint. The air outside was freezing, but it felt like a relief compared to the suffocating atmosphere in that house. As we reached the car, I turned back to look at the house one last time. The lights were still bright, and the music had started again, but now it was softer, almost a whisper. And through the window I saw them, all the guests standing there watching us leave, their faces blank, their eyes following us as we drove away. No one spoke the entire ride back. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustling of leaves outside the car. We were all too shaken to talk, too scared to make sense of what had just happened. But there was one thing I couldn't stop thinking about: the red mark on Nick's neck. When we finally got back to my apartment, I asked him to check it out. He went to the bathroom, peeled off his jacket, and looked in the mirror. "It's gone," he said, his voice shaky. But I swear, in the dim light of the bathroom, I saw it again. Just for a moment. That faint red mark, pulsing under his skin. And even now, I wonder, what would have happened if we hadn't left? For days after the party, none of us could shake the feeling that something wasn't right. We didn't talk about it at first, not in detail anyway. There was an unspoken agreement to just move on, pretend like it never happened. But the tension was there, simmering just beneath the surface. Every time I saw Nick, I caught myself staring at his neck, wondering if the mark had come back, if maybe it had just been hiding. He looked fine, acted fine, but the memory of that bright red mark haunted me. And to be honest, I think it haunted all of us. It wasn't until about a week later that everything came crashing down. It started small. Nick began complaining about headaches. Nothing too serious, just a dull ache behind his eyes that wouldn't go away. He brushed it off as stress from school, maybe a bad night's sleep, but something in his voice sounded off. He wasn't one to complain, and I could see it was wearing him down. The next day, he called in sick to work, which was strange for him. He never missed work. By the third day, the headaches had gotten worse. He stopped answering his phone, didn't show up to class, and when we finally went to check on him, his apartment was a mess. Dishes piled up, lights off, curtains drawn. Nick was slumped on his couch, pale, his eyes bloodshot, as if he hadn't slept in days. And there it was again, the mark on his neck. Not red this time, but a deep, almost black bruise. It had spread too, curling like dark tendrils up the side of his neck. "Nick, we need to get you to a doctor," Sarah said, her voice trembling with panic. He shook his head weakly. "No doctors. They won't help." "What do you mean they won't help?" "You look like death, man," Jake added, but even he looked terrified. I could see the fear in his eyes. Nick just stared at us, and for a second, his eyes looked empty. Vacant, like he wasn't really seeing us. Then, without warning, he grabbed my arm. His grip was ice cold, his fingers trembling. "You have to stay away from me," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "They're coming. I don't know how, but they're coming." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. "Who's coming?" He didn't answer. His grip loosened, and he slumped back against the couch, exhausted, his eyes fluttering shut. We didn't know what to do. He looked so bad, so drained, but he refused to go to the hospital. In the end, we decided to let him rest, hoping it was just some weird virus or maybe even exhaustion from school and work. But as we left his apartment, I couldn't shake his words. "They're coming." The next few days were a blur of anxiety and unanswered questions. We tried calling Nick, texting him, but he wasn't responding. I think deep down we were all afraid of what we'd find if we went back. Then one night, I got a call from Sarah around 2 a.m. She was sobbing so hard I could barely understand her. "Nick's gone," she gasped. "What do you mean gone?" I asked, my heart racing. "Did he leave? Is he okay?" "No, you don't understand," she choked out. "Jake went to check on him tonight, and he's dead. Nick's dead." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I couldn't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. Nick was dead? How? Why? We'd just seen him a few days ago. He was sick, but dead? I drove to Nick's apartment in a daze, my mind racing. When I got there, the paramedics were already outside, their faces grim. Jake and Sarah were sitting on the curb, huddled together, their eyes red and swollen from crying. I could barely process what they told me next. Nick had been found on his couch, just where we'd left him, but his body, something was wrong with it. His skin was pale, almost gray, and the mark on his neck had spread across his entire body, like dark, web-like veins. They said it didn't look like anything they'd ever seen. No signs of trauma, no injuries, just the marks. The official cause of death? Natural causes. But none of us believed that. After Nick died, everything changed. Jake and Sarah were constantly on edge, jumping at the slightest noise, constantly checking their own necks. Emma refused to leave her apartment. She started claiming she felt someone watching her, even inside her own home. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel it too. It was like a shadow had fallen over all of us, and it was getting worse. One night, about a week after Nick's death, I noticed it. I was brushing my teeth, standing in front of the mirror, when I saw it. A faint, greenish mark on the side of my neck, just below my ear. My heart dropped. I stared at it, my mind racing, my hands shaking as I reached up to touch it. It wasn't a bruise, it didn't hurt, but it was there. That same mark I'd seen on the guests at the party. The same mark Nick had before he died. I didn't know what to do. Panic surged through me and I grabbed my phone, dialing Sarah's number. She picked up after the first ring, her voice breathless. "It's happening to me," I whispered, my voice shaking. "What? What are you talking about?" she asked, clearly confused. "The mark. It's on my neck. It's happening to me too." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, in a voice so quiet I could barely hear it, she said, "I have it too." A cold, suffocating fear wrapped around me like a vice. We all had it. Whatever had happened at that party, whatever those marks were, they were coming for us. Just like they came for Nick. For the next few days, I tried everything to make sense of it. Doctors, research, even calling old contacts from the party. But there was nothing. No answers. No explanation. The marks were spreading, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. Then one night, a knock came at my door. It was past midnight, and the air outside was deathly still. I opened the door, and standing there was the same man from the party, the one who had asked who invited us. His face was as expressionless as ever, his eyes cold and piercing. "It's time," he said quietly. I didn't know what he meant, but I didn't have a choice. There was something in his voice, in his eyes, that told me resistance was pointless. Without a word, I followed him into the darkness. The cold night air bit at my skin, but I barely felt it. My mind was numb with fear. I walked with him down the street, through the woods, back to that house. That house, with the two bright lights and the strange music. When we reached the door, he turned to me and said, "You were never meant to be here, but now there's no way out." I still can't shake it. It's been months since that night, but the memory sits heavy on my chest like an invisible weight. When I close my eyes, I can still hear it, the crash, the sound of metal twisting, and that eerie, flickering light. I've gone over it 1,000 times, but it never makes any more sense than it did the moment it happened. It started as a weekend getaway. My husband, Mark, and I had been planning this camping trip for weeks. We both needed the break. You know how life just piles on sometimes, and you feel like you need to get away from it all? That's what we were after. Peace, quiet, a bit of nature to reset everything. We'd chosen a spot about 2 hours from home, deep in the woods by a small lake. It was beautiful, remote, and perfect for a few nights away from the world. We got to the campsite in the early afternoon, set up our tent, and spent the rest of the day hiking around the area, enjoying the cool October air and the sound of leaves crunching beneath our boots. It felt good to be out there, just the two of us. The sun was already starting to set by the time we got back to the campfire we'd built earlier, casting a warm glow over everything. We sat there, talking and laughing, listening to the crackling of the fire. It was one of those moments that feels almost perfect, you know? Like you could freeze it and live in it forever. Then we heard it. It was the kind of sound that cuts through everything else, sharp and violent, snapping you out of whatever peaceful moment you were in. A crash. No, more than that. A terrible, screeching, gut-wrenching sound. It came from somewhere down the road, not too far from where we were camping. Metal on metal, tires skidding, and then silence. Mark and I jumped up at the same time, both of us staring in the direction of the sound. For a second, neither of us said anything. It was like our brains were trying to process what we'd just heard. Then Mark grabbed the flashlight and we started running. "I think it was an accident," he said, his voice tight with urgency. I could feel my heart pounding as we hurried down the narrow dirt path that led back to the main road. My legs felt heavy, like they didn't want to move fast enough. The sound of our footsteps echoed in the darkness, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly ahead of us. The night had fallen quickly and the air had turned cold. That kind of sharp, biting cold that sinks into your bones. When we got to the road, we saw it. A car flipped on its side, steam hissing from the hood, and pieces of shattered glass scattered all over the asphalt. My stomach twisted. It was worse than I'd imagined. Mark ran ahead and I followed, feeling this awful sense of dread growing with every step. As we got closer, we saw the flashing red and blue lights of a police car already at the scene, casting an eerie glow over everything. I could see two officers standing near the wreckage, talking in hushed tones. One of them glanced up as we approached, and I could see the concern in his face. "Stay back," he said, holding up a hand to stop us. "We've got it under control." Mark looked at him, then back at the wreck, his face pale. "Is everyone okay?" The officer didn't answer right away. He just looked at us for a moment, then shook his head slightly. "There was only one person in the car," he said. "We're still assessing the situation." There was something in his voice, something off, like he was holding back. I glanced at the car again and felt a shiver run down my spine. The windshield was smashed in, and I could see blood on the dashboard. My mind was racing, imagining all the possible scenarios. Who had been driving? What had caused the crash? And why hadn't we heard anyone screaming for help? Mark tugged at my arm. "We should go," he whispered. "There's nothing we can do here." Reluctantly, I nodded, though every instinct in me wanted to stay and understand what had happened. But he was right. There was nothing we could do. So we turned and started back toward the campsite, our footsteps crunching on the gravel road as we left the flashing lights behind. The walk back was quiet. Too quiet. I kept expecting to hear something, another car, more sirens, anything, but the only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. The further we got from the road, the darker it became. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the only light we had was the weak beam from our flashlight. About halfway back to the campsite, Mark slowed down, his brow furrowed. "Did you see the look on that cop's face?" he asked, glancing over at me. I nodded. "Yeah, he seemed off, like he wasn't telling us everything." Mark didn't say anything after that, but I could tell he was thinking the same thing I was. Something about that crash didn't feel right. The way the car had been flipped, the silence from the driver, the strange behavior of the cops, it all felt wrong. But I didn't want to dwell on it. Not then, at least. I just wanted to get back to the safety of our campsite, to the fire and the tent, where everything felt normal. But when we got back, things were anything but normal. As we approached the campsite, I noticed it first, a faint, flickering light hovering just beyond the edge of the clearing. At first, I thought it was the fire, but the closer we got, the more I realized this light wasn't coming from the campfire at all. It was behind Mark. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. "Mark, what is that?" He turned, shining the flashlight toward the light, but the beam seemed to miss it entirely. It was like the light existed outside of the flashlight's reach, pulsing gently, almost like a heartbeat. "I don't know," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "What the hell is that?" The light flickered again, brighter this time, casting strange, shifting shadows across the trees. It didn't look like a lantern or a fire. It wasn't the glow of a flashlight or the beam of a car's headlights. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. And as I stared at it, this creeping sense of unease began to crawl up my spine. "Is it moving?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Mark stepped closer, squinting into the darkness, but the light didn't move. It just stayed there, flickering steadily, as if it were watching us. My heart was pounding in my chest now, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. "We need to leave," I whispered, suddenly feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. "Now." Mark hesitated for a second, his eyes still locked on the light. Then he nodded. "Yeah, let's go." We grabbed what little we had left at the campsite, our backpacks, the flashlight, and hurried toward the car, the flickering light still glowing faintly in the distance. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting it to follow us, but it stayed where it was, pulsing like a strange, unnatural beacon in the woods. The drive back to town was tense. Neither of us spoke, but I could feel the tension radiating off Mark. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I kept looking out the window, half expecting to see that flickering light again, but the darkness outside was thick, and impenetrable. When we finally got home, it was past midnight. We barely said a word as we unpacked the car, both of us too rattled to talk about what had just happened. I could feel the unease settling deep in my bones, like a sickness I couldn't shake. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that flickering light, felt its strange, almost sentient presence. The next morning, I did what I always do when something doesn't make sense. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a reflection or some kind of electrical interference. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me after the shock of hearing the accident. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. There was something out there, something we couldn't explain. A few days later, I couldn't stand it anymore. I called the local police station asking about the crash we'd witnessed. The officer on the other end of the line was polite, but when I asked about the details of the accident, there was a long pause. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said finally, his voice low, "but there was no crash reported that night." I froze. "What do you mean? We were there. We saw the car. We saw the cops." "I understand, but I'm telling you, there was no accident on that road. No calls, no reports, nothing." My hands were shaking as I hung up the phone. I told Mark, and he went quiet for a long time, his face pale. Neither of us had an explanation. It didn't make sense. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the shadows outside the window stretch long and dark, I catch a flicker of light out of the corner of my eye, just for a second. And I wonder if it's all in my head or if that light is still watching us. After that phone call, everything felt different between Mark and me. We tried to go on with our lives, work, the usual day-to-day stuff, but there was this tension hanging over us like a cloud we couldn't escape. I could tell he was trying to pretend it didn't bother him, but every now and then I'd catch him looking out the window at night, staring off into the dark woods behind our house. We never talked about the light after that call, but it was always there, lingering in the back of our minds. It wasn't until about a week later that things started to get worse. The first time I saw it again, I was alone. Mark was working late, and I was sitting in the living room, trying to distract myself by watching TV. The wind was howling outside, rattling the windows, and the house felt unusually cold, like there was a draft seeping in from somewhere. I remember wrapping a blanket tighter around me, trying to focus on the show, but then I saw it, just for a split second, out of the corner of my eye. A faint flicker, just outside the window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned my head to look, but by the time I did, the light was gone. The backyard was pitch black, nothing but the swaying trees and the faint outline of our old shed in the distance. I tried to tell myself it was just a reflection, or maybe a car passing by, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was the same light, that same eerie, flickering glow. I sat there for a while, staring out the window, waiting for it to appear again, but it didn't. Not that night, at least. When Mark came home, I didn't tell him about it. I didn't want him to think I was losing it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the light was coming back, and it wasn't going to stop. The second time it appeared, Mark saw it too. We were sitting in bed, reading before going to sleep. It had been a quiet evening, and for a moment I almost felt like things were normal again. But then Mark stopped mid-sentence, his eyes fixed on the window across the room. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice tight with fear. I didn't have to ask what he was talking about. I turned my head slowly, my heart racing, and there it was. The light, flickering just beyond the glass, pulsing softly, almost like it was breathing. "Jesus," Mark muttered, throwing off the blankets and getting out of bed. He grabbed the flashlight from his nightstand and stormed to the window, his jaw clenched. I followed him, my stomach twisted in knots. He threw open the window, shining the flashlight out into the yard. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and the edge of our yard, but there was nothing there. No light, just the cold, empty night. "I don't get it," he muttered, frustration creeping into his voice. "Where the hell is it coming from?" I didn't have an answer. All I could do was stare out into the night, my skin prickling with fear. The light was gone, but the feeling it left behind lingered. That same sense of being watched, of something out there, just beyond our reach. For the next few days, we tried to ignore it, but the light kept coming back. It didn't happen every night, but when it did, It always appeared in the same way, faint at first, then brighter, flickering like a dying candle. It always seemed to stay just out of reach, never revealing its source. Sometimes it would hover outside the windows, other times it would flash in the backyard or near the edge of the woods. Mark became obsessed. Every time the light appeared, he'd grab the flashlight and go outside, pacing around the yard, trying to find something, anything that would explain it. But there was never anything there. I could see it was driving him crazy, the not knowing. And honestly, it was driving me crazy too. One night, about 2 weeks after the first time we saw it, Mark decided he was going to stay up all night and watch for it. He was convinced that if he could just stay awake long enough, he'd catch whatever was causing it. I tried to convince him it was a bad idea, but he wouldn't listen. So I went to bed alone, feeling this growing pit of dread in my stomach. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of the front door creaking open. Groggy and disoriented, I sat up in bed, rubbing my eyes. Mark wasn't in bed next to me. The faint glow of the TV flickered from the living room, but something felt off. I could feel it, that strange heaviness in the air. Quietly, I got out of bed and crept down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. As I reached the living room, I saw Mark standing by the front door, staring out into the yard. The door was open, just a crack, and the cold night air was seeping in. "Mark," I whispered, my voice shaky. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on something outside. Slowly, I moved closer, my hands trembling as I reached for his arm. "Mark, what's going on?" That's when I saw it, the light. But this time, it wasn't flickering in the distance. It was right there, just beyond the doorway. A pale, pulsing glow, almost too bright to look at. It hovered there, silently, casting strange shadows across Mark's face. He didn't move. He just stared at it, like he was in some kind of trance. "Mark," I said again, louder this time, my voice breaking. "We need to go. Close the door." But he didn't move. His eyes were wide, his expression blank, and I could feel this cold dread spreading through me like ice water. The light pulsed again, brighter, and I swear I saw something, just for a moment, moving inside it. A shape, a figure, but not human. Panic surged through me, and I grabbed Mark's arm, yanking him back from the doorway. He blinked, his trance broken, and looked at me like he didn't know where he was. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, pulling him away from the light. "Now." He nodded, his face pale, and together we slammed the door shut, locking it behind us. The light flickered once more outside the window, then vanished into the darkness. We didn't sleep that night. We sat there in the living room, the curtains drawn, the door locked, waiting for the light to return. But it didn't, not that night at least. The next day, Mark packed up the car and we left. We didn't tell anyone about what we'd seen. Who would believe us? We barely believed it ourselves. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet and the world feels still, I think about that light. I wonder if it's still out there, waiting, watching. And I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't closed that door in time. Because deep down, I know that whatever it wasn't done with us yet. I'll never forget that camping trip. What was supposed to be a peaceful weekend away turned into something none of us can really explain. Even now, months later, the thought of it makes my skin crawl. Every time I talk about it, my hands start to tremble, and I feel that same cold knot in my stomach that I did that night. I don't know what we saw, and I'm not sure I ever want to understand it fully. But it happened, and I can't shake the feeling that it was real. It was spring, and a group of us had decided to go camping near a river just a few hours outside the city. You know how spring feels after a long winter. Everything fresh, the air a little warmer, the trees starting to bloom again. We wanted to get out of town, away from work and life, and just relax for a weekend. There were 5 of us, me, my girlfriend Jess, her brother Nate, and 2 of our friends, Kelly and Mike. We'd done trips like this before, nothing fancy, just a couple of tents, some food, and a weekend of hiking and swimming. The place we picked was perfect, secluded, right by a bend in the river, with tall trees that made you feel like you were a million miles away from civilization. We arrived in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting that warm golden light that makes everything look peaceful. We set up our tents near the riverbank, close enough that we could hear the water rushing over the rocks. It was soothing, almost hypnotic. Everything seemed normal at first. We unpacked, got a fire going, and just sat around talking, watching the sky turn from orange to deep purple as the sun set behind the trees. The air was cool but not cold, and for a while it felt like we were the only people in the world. But then, not long after dusk, something felt off. I remember it vividly because it was one of those feelings you can't quite put into words. It started with a sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but it wasn't. It was more rhythmic, like footsteps. But they were distant, barely noticeable. The kind of thing you almost ignore, thinking it's just your mind playing tricks on you. "Did you hear that?" Jess asked, glancing at me from across the campfire. "Hear what?" I played dumb, but I had heard it too. I just didn't want to acknowledge it yet. No one wants to be the first to suggest something strange is going on. You feel silly even thinking it. She didn't push it, but I could tell she was uneasy. Nate and Mike were still talking, laughing about some story, completely oblivious to anything else. Kelly was off by the edge of the river, skipping stones into the water, her back to us. That's when I noticed it, the first sign that something was wrong. There, just beyond the tree line, I saw them. Figures. At first, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. They were far enough away that they were only shapes, barely visible in the fading light. But they were there, standing still, just at the edge of the woods, maybe 50 feet from our campsite. "Hey guys," I said, my voice low, trying not to sound as freaked out as I felt. "Do you see that?" Nate turned first, then Jess. I saw her eyes widen, and her hand instinctively reached for mine. "What the hell?" she whispered. Mike and Kelly joined us, and we all stood there in silence, staring into the woods. The figures didn't move. They just stood there, motionless, like they were watching us. I couldn't make out any details, just the vague outline of people. 5 or 6 of them, maybe more. And they were all dressed in white. "Are they people?" Kelly asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I muttered, though my heart was already pounding in my chest. Something about them felt wrong. They were too still, too quiet. If they were other campers or hikers, they should have called out, right? Or moved. But these figures just stood there, completely silent. "We should go talk to them," Nate said, but his voice didn't sound convincing. I could tell he was as unnerved as the rest of us, even though he was trying to play it cool. "No way," Jess snapped, gripping my arm tighter. "I don't like this. I don't like them." And neither did I. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to stay away from those figures, to pack up and leave. But we didn't. We just stood there, frozen, staring at them like they were some kind of optical illusion, something our minds couldn't quite process. After what felt like forever, one of them moved. It wasn't much, just a slight shift, like they were turning their head or adjusting their stance. But it was enough to snap us out of whatever trance we were in. "We should go inside the tents," Mike suggested, his voice low. "Just give them space." That's what we did. We backed away slowly, not taking our eyes off the figures, and slipped into our tents. But sleep? Sleep was impossible. We didn't talk much after that, just zipped ourselves into the thin nylon walls of our tents and lay there, listening to the sound of the river and waiting for, I don't know, something. It must have been around midnight when I heard the sound again. Footsteps, but this time they were closer. I felt Jess stir next to me. "Are you awake?" she whispered. "Yeah." "I hear it too," she said. I nodded, my heart racing. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, peeking out into the night. The fire had died down to embers, casting a dim, flickering light over the campsite. But beyond that, everything was dark. I couldn't see the figures anymore, but I could feel them. They were still out there. I knew it. "We should leave." Jess whispered, "Something's not right." "I know," I said, but the idea of packing up and hiking out in the middle of the night felt just as terrifying. What if they were waiting for us, watching us leave? The footsteps stopped for a while, and I thought maybe, just maybe, they had gone. But then out of nowhere, a low rustling sound came from outside, like fabric brushing against the ground. I slowly aimed the flashlight at the edge of the trees. They were closer, so much closer. The figures had moved silently, standing now just a few feet from the campsite. Their white clothes were visible in the dim light, and I could see more detail now. They were wearing long, flowing robes or gowns, pale and loose, almost like hospital gowns. Their faces were hidden in shadow, but I could feel their eyes on us, watching, waiting. Jess, I barely breathed the word. She looked out, saw what I saw, and gasped. We have to go. I nodded, my hands shaking as I grabbed my boots. I could hear Kelly and Mike stirring in their tent, whispering to each other, but I didn't want to call out. I didn't want to draw attention to us, not with those things so close. But then, as I was lacing up my boots, something happened that made my blood run cold. One of the figures, one of the ones closest to us, reached up and pulled back their hood. I saw their face, just for a second, illuminated by the faint light of the dying fire. It wasn't a face at all. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and the eyes, God, the eyes were hollow, empty, like the sockets had been gouged out. There was no nose, just smooth, featureless skin, and the mouth was a wide, gaping hole that stretched too far across the face. I froze. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All I could do was stare as this thing tilted its head as if it was studying me. Jess grabbed my arm, yanking me back into the tent, and that broke the spell. We're leaving, now, I said, my voice barely a whisper. We scrambled out of the tent, trying to pack up as quickly and quietly as possible. I could see the others doing the same. Mike was shaking, his hands fumbling with the tent poles, and Kelly was on the verge of tears. Nate was trying to keep it together, but I could see the fear in his eyes. As we packed, I glanced back toward the figures. They hadn't moved. They just stood there, watching us in eerie silence, their hollow faces turned in our direction. We didn't even bother taking everything. We grabbed what we could and started hiking, the cold night air biting at our faces as we hurried along the trail. The sound of the river faded behind us, replaced by the rustling of the trees and the pounding of our footsteps. I don't know how long we hiked. Time seemed to blur together in that terrifying dark forest. Every so often I'd glance behind me, half expecting to see those figures following us. And each time I looked, my heart stopped, because they were. Not running, not chasing, just walking, slowly, methodically, always keeping the same distance, but never letting us out of their sight. We kept moving, faster and faster, our breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. My legs felt like they were on fire, but the adrenaline kept me going. You ever have one of those days where nothing seems real anymore? It's like the world just slips out of your hands, and no matter how hard you try, you can't seem to hold on to it. That's how it all started for me. I didn't know it at the time, but the moment I met Phoebe, everything began to unravel. Let me start from the beginning. I've been on the streets of New York for a while now. You get used to it, the cold, the hunger, the looks people give you. It's a kind of survival that makes you numb after a while. You don't expect things to get better, so when they don't, it's almost like a relief. No more surprises, right? Except there are always surprises. And what happened that night, I don't think I'll ever get used to that. It was late and I was wandering around Midtown, trying to find a place to sleep for the night. The streets were quiet, more so than usual. You know how the city has this buzz like it's alive? But that night, something was off. It felt wrong. The air was heavy, like the calm before a storm. I wrapped my jacket tighter around me and kept my head down, trying not to think too much about it. Then I saw her, Phoebe. She couldn't have been more than 20. I noticed her because she looked lost, like she didn't belong there. She was standing at the corner of 5th and 42nd, just staring at the road. No phone, no bag, nothing. Just standing there. I almost didn't stop, but something about her, I don't know, maybe I saw a bit of myself in her. That same look of hopelessness. I was about to walk by when I saw it, a car, barreling down the street like it didn't care that there was a red light, heading straight for her. Everything happened in slow motion. I yelled, but she didn't move. She just stood there, like she didn't hear me. Without thinking, I lunged at her, pulling her out of the way just as the car sped by. But as I did, I felt something hit me. Not hard, more like a gentle nudge, and then everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the street, but it was different. The usual chaos of New York, the honking, the people, the lights, all of it was gone. I could still see the city around me, but it was like I was in some kind of bubble. It was empty. The lights in the buildings were out, the traffic lights were dead, and the air, it felt thick, suffocating almost. But the strangest part, Phoebe was gone. 1 second, I was pulling her to safety, and the next, she had vanished. I stood up, brushing off the dust from my jacket, trying to make sense of it all. I figured maybe I hit my head or something, and I was just seeing things. But the more I looked around, the more real it all felt. The emptiness, the cold that seemed to seep into my bones, it was all too real. "Phoebe?" I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. Nothing. I was alone. I started walking, trying to find someone, anyone. But the streets were deserted. Every shop, every cafe, every building, all empty. It was like the whole city had just up and left, leaving me behind. My heart was racing now, that rising panic you get when you know something's wrong, but you don't know how to fix it. I walked for what felt like hours, but no matter where I went, it was the same. Dead silence. I thought about the car, the one that hit me. Maybe I was dead, and this was some kind of purgatory, but I didn't feel dead. I felt scared, confused, but very much alive. Just as I was about to give up, I heard it, a faint sound, like footsteps. I turned around, and there she was, Phoebe, standing at the end of the street, her back to me. Relief washed over me. I wasn't alone. "Phoebe!" I shouted, running towards her. But she didn't turn around. She just stood there, perfectly still, her head tilted slightly to the side, like she was listening to something I couldn't hear. When I got closer, I reached out to touch her shoulder, but the moment I did, she vanished. 1 second she was there, and the next she was gone, like a puff of smoke. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell was going on? I turned around again, and this time the city wasn't empty. People were there, hundreds of them, but they weren't moving. They were just standing still, their faces turned away from me. My stomach twisted in knots as I realized they weren't people. Not really. They were shadows, outlines of people, like silhouettes cut from paper. The wind picked up, a low howling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The shadows began to move, slowly at first, then faster, swirling around me like a tornado. I tried to run, but no matter which direction I went, the shadows were there, closing in on me. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I could feel the panic rising in my throat. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped, and there was no way out. And then, in the middle of the chaos, I saw her again. Phoebe. This time, she was smiling. It wasn't a friendly smile, though. It was cold, calculating, like she knew something I didn't. "You saved me," she said, her voice echoing in the empty streets. "Now it's your turn." Before I could ask what she meant, the shadows closed in. I felt their icy fingers wrapping around my body, pulling me down into the darkness. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I was back on the street, lying in the same spot where I had pulled Phoebe out of the way. The noise of the city had returned, the honking horns, the chatter of people, the distant sirens. Everything was back to normal. Except it wasn't. I stood up, looking around. The world felt different now, like I was seeing it through a distorted lens. The people around me, they were moving, talking, going about their lives, but none of them seemed real. They were like the shadows I had seen before, just going through the motions. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that I was just imagining things. But when I caught my reflection in a storefront window, I knew. I wasn't me anymore. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't my face. It was Phoebe.